Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are on a listen-only mode until the question-and-answer session of today's conference. At that time, to ask a question, press star and the number 1 on your phone and record your name at the prompt. This call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I will now turn the call over to Andrew Haight. Thank you. You may begin.
Great. Thank you so much. So my name is Andy Haight. I'm an economist at the U.S. Census Bureau at our headquarters office in Maryland, and I want to welcome you all this afternoon to the webinar that we are doing that features data from the 2017 Economic Census Geographic Area Statistics. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today's webinar. And right up front, I am going to apologize in advance for any noises you might hear. One of the joys of working at home is your neighbor decides to mow his lawn at the time that you're doing a webinar, or blow some leaves, or other wonderful, joyous things. So again, today's webinar is going to be to talk about the local area data that we've been releasing as part of the Economic Census. We are going to be presenting some selected findings from the 2017 Economic Census Geographic Area Statistics. I'm going to be sharing some sorts and other kind of rankings that I've pulled from the data. And the data that I'm going to be sharing with you all is going to be shown at the sector and the state levels. I want to make a point, though, of saying that the data that we have from the Economic Census Geographic Area Statistics is also available at the 3, 4, 5, and 6-digit North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS levels, and it is also available geographically from the state level down to metros, counties, and even places. As a reminder to everybody, a place in the economic programs is a city, town, village, or borough that has at least 2,500 population or 2,500 jobs. The goals for today's webinar are, number one, to help raise awareness of the data that's available from the Economic Census. This webinar is going to complement an America Counts story that I released back on November 5th. I've provided the link to that story here on the screen that talked about these data. But my other goal of this presentation is really to encourage you all to explore these data further. As I was pulling the information from for this webinar, I myself was curious to see just what is going on in each of these states. For example, when I saw that a particular sector was very important in a certain state that I was interested in, I wanted to know, well, I wonder which industries within that sector are the key industries. If healthcare is really important to the state of Maryland, is that healthcare from a doctor's office perspective, or is that healthcare from a hospital's perspective? Which is the top employer? Also, I was really curious about geographically. When we talk about a state being number 1 ranked in a particular sector, is that sector big across all counties in the state, or are there certain counties that really dominate? There certainly are some states where the economy is almost evenly distributed across each of the counties. And then we have other states, perhaps like New Mexico, where you have large concentrations of population in certain counties and much more rural areas in other parts of the state. So as we walk through these data, I do want to encourage you all to go in and explore the data later to see just what exactly is going on at the more detailed industry levels and at those more detailed geographies. In my rankings, I'm going to be providing 2 sorts of rankings. First, we're going to talk about how does my state, or how does a state, compare to other states at the national level. What are the top states in the United States in terms of certain things like establishments, employment, payroll, and sales? And how do those states compare to other states? But also I want to talk about data from the sector perspective. What are the sectors that are the most important to my state? And we're going to talk a little bit about the sectors that were the biggest in 2017 and sectors that have also seen the largest growth from the 2012 to the 2017 economic census year. Now, one quick point I want to make before we move into the actual presentation is to talk about why are we talking about 2017 data. The 2017 economic census is currently being released, and in many ways, the economic census provides the most detailed statistics that we have on the U.S. economy available from the U.S. Census Bureau. When we think about the rankings of sectors in a certain state or what states, how they rank in terms of others, very often those rankings do not change dramatically from year to year. The industry sector that may be ranked number one year could move to position 2 or 3 in a particular year, but the overall rankings often don't change dramatically. So while these data we're going to be talking about are a little old, quote unquote, they often will represent even the current reality that we're seeing. Now, of course, under the pandemic, certain sectors of our economy have really taken a hit more than others. And for those, of course, you would want to look at the more detailed economic indicator surveys to see how are those sectors doing. But those economic indicator surveys are primarily only shown at the national level. The Econ Census is really pretty unique in that we give full access to the full set of data on establishments, employment, payroll, and some measure of output down to the most detailed geographies and the most detailed industry levels available. So in a lot of ways, the economic census really continues to be the best source of these kinds of rankings. Now, before we get started, of course, I want to remind everybody that the Census Bureau is much more than just simply the decennial census. We conduct more than 130 monthly, quarterly, annual, and periodic censuses, surveys, and programs each and every single year. As you all know, we just finished collection of the data for the 2020 decennial census, but every single year we conduct the American Community Survey, which is a fabulous resource that provides demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data down to the census tract and even the block group level. So it's a great resource for businesses to use to understand their potential customers of their business, for economic development officials and chambers of commerce staff to understand how their economy and how their populations are changing in their service area, and scores of other types of uses. In addition to those demographic programs, though, we conduct 58 business surveys. And the pyramid on the right is a good way to think of those business surveys. At the top of the pyramid is our monthly and quarterly surveys. We do 17 economic indicator programs in our economic directorate at the Census Bureau. Those surveys primarily are shown only at the national level and produce a fairly limited amount of detail, as you can sort of tell by the size of the pyramid. But they are also baseline and benchmarked back to those more detailed annual programs, which are then baseline and benchmarked back to the 5-year economic census. So in many ways, our ability to get a complete, full measure of all employer businesses in the United States during the economic census is critical to our ability to publish data annually, quarterly, and monthly in these other sample programs. The economic census, then, is the most detailed economic program that we do at the Census Bureau. It covers nearly every 2 through 6-digit North American Industry Classification System code, or NAICS code. There are a few exclusions. We do not publish data on farms because the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Agricultural Statistics Service, or USDA NASS, is responsible for conducting the Census of Agriculture and the other agriculture programs. We don't cover data on colleges and universities because they are covered by the National Center for Education Statistics. I provided a link to the list of exclusions, but in general terms, we account for about 98% of all the businesses in the United States are covered by the economic census. Geographically, this is also one of our most detailed programs as well. It does publish data down to the county and place levels. Some of you who are long-term users of economic census data may notice that I don't have on this slide zip codes. Historically, we have published the economic census by zip code, For 2017, we dropped the zip code level data, but there is no reason to fret. We actually are continuing to publish the zip code level data annually in the Zip Code Business Patterns program. And in many ways, the ZBP data is as good, if not better, than what the zip code data was in the Economic Census because you get it every year. The Economic Census is also our most detailed program in terms of the other dimensions that we publish. At the beginning of December, we will be releasing the establishment and firm size reports, which are the reports that show data broken out by business size. This is a real wealth of information that helps users understand the importance of small businesses. And actually, I'm going to be doing a webinar on December 8th to talk about that business size data. It's the most detailed program in terms of the data variables being shown. Today, we're going to be focusing on employment, establishments, payroll, and some measure of output, whether that be sales, shipments, receipts, or revenue, but there are a host of other data variables shown as well. Tomorrow, we will be releasing our NAICS-based, our North American Product Classification System-based product lines data. These are the detailed statistics that talk about what types of products and services are provided by businesses in the United States. So when you think about the sales of a grocery store, we would publish the total sales of grocery stores as part of our regular statistics, but we would also then publish a detailed breakout of the different types of products and services provided by grocery stores. So we would publish data, for example, on baked goods, on canned goods, on produce, poultry, things along those lines. These product lines data are very unique that are published in the Economic Census. It is the only program at Census that publishes comprehensive product line data for all sectors or nearly all sectors of the U.S. economy. Those data will be going live tomorrow. There will be a press release on it, and I will be doing a webinar on the NAICS data on December 1st. So if you have not already bookmarked and put that into your calendar, please go ahead, 2 p.m. Eastern Time on December 1st. These data are being released on our new data.census.gov platform, but we've also just recently added them to version 3.2 of Census Business Builder, and some more data will be added in the December/January 3.3 release of Census Business Builder. This slide provides a little bit of information about that release schedule. As you can see on the slide, we started releasing data from the Economic Census in September of last year in what we called the First Look Report. In August of this year, we completed the geographic area statistics, which is the data we're going to be featuring today. And then tomorrow is when we again have that NAICS data, those product statistics. And on December 3rd, we'll have the data on establishment and firm size. So there's still more data coming. We have lots more information coming. The miscellaneous subjects reports come out later on next year. That'll be great. And yes, Jennifer, we will still continue to keep Census Business Builder. We'll continue to enhance the data that's in there, the new functionality. In fact, I'm going to be doing a webinar in December on the new release of CBB because there's some really exciting new features. Just to give you a little tiny bit of a hint, we are going to be doing multivariate mapping in Census Business Builder. You'll now be able to view more than one variable on the map at a time. And when we think about comparing the 2017 Economic Census data back to the 2012 Economic Census and going back further than that, there are a couple of things that you always need to keep in mind when you're doing that comparison. And this is my sort of opportunity to get up on my soapbox a tiny bit. Anytime you're doing time series comparisons with any data, not just Census Bureau data, but also data from other sources, you always need to make sure that the thing that you're comparing is comparable. As many of us know, the boundaries of geographic areas change constantly. We haven't added a state to the United States in a long time, but the boundaries of counties, places, and metropolitan areas do change, and often those changes can actually affect the comparability of the data for that geography over time. For example, the town that I live in Maryland, had a boundary change And that new boundary now includes about 40 businesses that have been in that area for years, maybe decades, but were never considered part of the town that I live in. When they annexed, if you will, that area, those businesses are now included in the data for my town. So if I was not paying attention to that boundary change, I might think that the economy of my town had increased quite a bit when, in fact, a large portion of that increase is due to boundary change, not real economic growth. At the Census Bureau, we take this pretty seriously, and we've got a lot of resources available to you to help you understand those changes and so that you can make the decision about whether or not those data are comparable or not. I have included the links to our geographies page where you can go in and learn about those geographic area changes. We also have a webbing application called TigerWeb Econ that allows you to view those boundary changes on a map. In addition, though, there are also industry classification system changes. When I did the comparisons today that you're going to see in today's webinar, I did those at the 2-digit NAICS sector. And at the 2-digit sector, there were no changes from 2012 to 2017 NAICS. However, within the 2-digit NAICS sectors, there were a number of changes. In fact, 6 sectors under the NAICS classification system had some type of industry change, either where industries were split, where industries were combined, or where pieces of industries were pulled out and moved into other industries. So again, when you're making those NAICS comparisons over time, you want to make sure that you're comparing something that's comparable. We've got those resources available on our NAICS website, which again, I included. Now, the last 2 things I want to mention about changes in the economic census. The first is, of course, that we have moved to a new dissemination platform. We are publishing all the data for 2017 Econ Census on the new data.census.gov platform. This platform replaces American Fact Finder, and I will tell you, as someone who was involved in the early design of this platform, or at least the functional requirements for it, I have real hopes that this platform will really be able to do some amazing things in the future. The basic way that they designed the platform allows users, or will allow users, to do things that they could never do in American Fact Finder. So, yes, I know it's a bummer that you lost your beloved American Fact Finder. I will say I bemoaned it for a short while, too, maybe more than a short while. But data.census.gov is here to stay, and I would really encourage you all to check it out. The other bullet that I have highlighted here in red is sort of the bummer part of the presentation. As many of you know, our data are all subject to Title 13 of the U.S. Code regulations. Title 13 says that we cannot publish data that would disclose the identity of individual respondents. Whether those respondents are people, households, or whether they are businesses, the rule still applies. And historically, we've done a lot of work to make sure that a user could not take our data and understand and identify individual businesses. Now, as many of you know, our data, the data that we actually publish, includes data that was reported to us by businesses, but it also is commingled with data that we received from other administrative sources, including data from the Internal Revenue Service. We use the IRS data as a proxy for non-response. So when a business does not respond to the economic census, we use the IRS data as a replacement for that response data. Starting with the 2017 economic census and starting with the 2017 years for a lot of our other programs, we are now bound by some new IRS disclosure rules that are having an impact on the data that we publish. Especially when you're looking at data for smaller states. I picked on New Mexico earlier, I'll pick on them again. When you look at states that are smaller in terms of their economy, you will find more cases where we've had to suppress data for small geographies than we've ever had before. The tip for you all is that you should always start as broad as you can in terms of geography and in terms of industry. So today we are looking at two-digit NAICS sectors by state. As we drill from state down to metro, county, and place, you will see an increasing number of suppressions of their data, of the data for those geographies. And same thing as you drill from the two-digit sectors to the 3, 4, 5, and 6-digit NAICS codes, you will see an increasing number of suppressions. Large states are obviously affected less by these new disclosure rules simply because there are more businesses in those states. It's really those states and those geographies and industries where you have a relatively small number of businesses, even at the state level, where you sometimes see suppressions. So, as I mentioned, we released, beginning of November, an America Count story that talked about the data from the Economic Census. In that story, we highlighted the dominance of California in many of the sectors of the economy. You see that dominance in Figure 1 and in Figure 2 here on this particular slide. We also then talked about that it's not all California, that there are other states that also did very well in the 2017 Economic Census and in the change between 2012 and 2017. Figure 3 from the story showed some information about the sectors where Texas led the nation in employment growth. We also talked about some other states. The District of Columbia happens to be a state that is really sort of somewhat surprisingly and somewhat not surprisingly very dominant in certain sectors of the economy. We provided a little bit of information about that, but we also then talked a little bit about the sectors themselves. I know we often think of our economy as being primarily service-based, but there are still states where manufacturing is ranked number 1. Figure 5 from the American Count story provided some information on that. And finally, in Figure 6 here, we talked about the healthcare sector. This sector happens to be a huge sector in the U.S. economy. Today, we're going to be drilling down into this in a little bit more detail. So let's first start about how does each state compare to others at the national level. So when we think about the number of establishments, and these are individual business locations, and yes, Jennifer, the Economic Census does only publish data on employer businesses. Non-employers are not covered by the Economic Census. We can clearly see the dominance of California in the U.S. economy. It is by far our largest state in terms of population, and California actually dominates in 16 of the 18 sectors covered by the Economic Census. The only 2 sectors where California is not ranked number 1 in the nation is the mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction sector, and the utility sector. Those 2 sectors, Texas is actually ranked number 1 in those 2 sectors. An establishment, again, is a business at a single physical location. And publishing establishment-based data is a key hallmark of the Economic Census because doing that allows users to better understand the businesses that are physically located in their particular state or their area, not just those that are potentially headquartered there. When you think about a company-based survey where all of the employees, all of the revenue of that business would be tabulated where that company is headquartered, that would be a very different look at the U.S. economy. You'd see this huge number of businesses in Delaware, for example, when they may have manufacturing businesses or other locations scattered all over the country. We do conduct some programs at the Census Bureau that are firm-based, and we even publish some firm-level data in the Economic Census, but at its heart of hearts, the Economic Census is an establishment-based survey, and that's what allows us to publish this really rich industry and geographic level data. Now, California is also, and I apologize for this bell here going off, California is also ranked number 1 when you think about the change in number of establishments. But its dominance is not nearly as great. Only 11 of the 18 sectors in terms of the growth of businesses between 2012 and 2017 happened in California. As you can see on the slide, Texas led the nation in the mining, wholesale, and management of companies and enterprises. sectors. Those three sectors saw the biggest growth in number of businesses in Texas. In North Carolina, it was the utility sector that was ranked number one in terms of the utility sector in North Carolina. North Carolina was ranked number one in the nation. And finally, Florida, I apologize for the yellow, very hard to read. Florida was actually ranked number one in the administrative and support and waste management and remediation services, in the manufacturing sector, which I personally found quite interesting, and in the retail trade sector. Now, when we think about the dominance of certain sectors to certain states, to me, in a lot of ways, these dominant sectors speak to how resilient or not a particular geography, a particular sector is to that economy. A state that is very heavily invested in a certain sector, if that sector is then impacted by a shock, such as a pandemic, the potential impact of that state might be bigger than a state that is more evenly distributed across different sectors. So understanding the rankings of sectors by state is very important to think about how growth of our economy is not always happening just in these large states. Now, this next slide talks about employment. And once again, we see that California really leads. In this case, again, 16 of the 18 sectors. But again, we see that two other states actually were ranked number one when it comes to the number of workers. Texas was ranked number one again in the mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction sector. As you can probably guess, and yes, I did check this myself, the biggest industry or subsector within that sector is, of course, oil and gas extraction. But I was surprised to see that there is actually still a good amount of mining activity and quarrying activity occurring in the state of Texas. More interestingly, though, I saw that Florida was ranked number one in terms of the administrative and support and waste management and remediation services sector. Now, having a family member who lives in Florida, I was really curious about that. One of the industries that is very, very dominant in Florida is the professional employer organization, or PEO industry. These are employee leasing companies. They happen to be very dominant in Florida, and a large share of the employment of this 1.7 million employees that work in this sector in Florida are in that particular industry. So again, thinking about the importance of a particular sector to an industry, sometimes that sector and its importance is distributed across all the industries in that sector. When we think about the importance of the utility sector for California, the utility sector not only includes power plants that are powered by fossil fuels, but it also includes power generation facilities that are powered by solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass. And California leads in the utility sector in each of those sectors. So again, thinking about how these states are ranked and the different things that are dominant in that state. In terms of change in employment, you'll notice, again, California, shown in blue, does actually account for a fairly substantial portion. 10 of the sectors are, California is ranked number one in those 10 sectors in terms of the increase in employment between 2012 and 2017, but a few other states kind of popped in here as well. I was really intrigued to see that Wisconsin was actually ranked number one in the increase in employment in the mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction industry. I would not normally think of Wisconsin as being a state that would be heavily involved in that sector, but apparently that's the state that actually saw the most increase in employment in that sector. Texas is ranked number one for the utilities, wholesale, finance, professional, scientific, and technical services, and educational services sector. And yes, one of the notes I just saw pop up was asking about architectural businesses, architecture businesses. Yes, they are counted as part of the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. So this big increase in Texas in employment in that sector, it would be interesting to see how much of that increase in that sector, that 96,000 employee increase, was due to that particular industry. Michigan, I guess you could say maybe happily, is ranked number one in terms of employment increase for the manufacturing sector, the green bar here. We typically think of Michigan as being a big manufacturing state, and again, it would be very interesting to see this increase in employment in manufacturing. Is this motor vehicle manufacturing, is it all in motor vehicle manufacturing, or are there other manufacturing sectors, industries in Michigan that also saw a big increase? And finally, once again, we see that Florida really dominated in terms of the change in employment between 2012 and 2017 in that admin and support and waste management and remediation services sector. On the previous slide, we saw that they were the top employer with 1.7 million employees in that particular sector. That number is up a little bit more than 500,000 employees between 2012 and 2017. PEOs, professional employer organizations, are businesses that lease employees to other businesses. So if a manufacturer, for example, that sees major seasonal swings in their employment, to deal with those seasonal swings, they could hire employees and then let them go, and then hire them back and then let them go. Or they could actually work with an employee leasing company and essentially lease the employees for that period of time that they need that spike in employment. These businesses are very common, very popular in Florida. I'm not quite sure why they centered themselves in Florida, but it happens to be an industry that is very common in the state of Florida, probably for some tax reason, and that is probably a big chunk of this 516,000 increase in employment in this industry between 2012 and 2017. Again, something else to dig into when I have some free time over the holidays. Now, in the Economic Census, we also publish data on payroll, and it's very easy for someone to go in and do an average annual payroll per employment, and I was really sort of curious to see how do states rank when you think about the average payroll per employee in a sector in that state. This chart shows in the orangey sort of red color the national average annual payroll per employment for that particular sector. And then in blue, it shows the state that has the highest average annual payroll per employment in that state. I was quite fascinated to see that California only ranks number one in one sector, that is the management of companies and enterprises. On average, employees who work in that sector earn $134,132, slightly more than the 100 and something thousand that's at the national level. More interestingly, living here in the D.C. metropolitan area, I was really intrigued that D.C., the District of Columbia, ranks number one in 8 sectors: utilities, transportation, real estate, professional, scientific and technical services, educational services, healthcare, arts, and other services. Those of you who know anything about the D.C. area know that this is a fairly expensive place to live, and businesses apparently pay their employees in their sectors pretty well in the D.C. area in comparison to the national average. So again, giving D.C. something to crow about, this is a great place to work if you work in the healthcare sector or in the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector. You're going to earn in arts, entertainment, and recreation more than double what the national average is for that industry. But again, the question is that all industries in the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector, or are there certain industries that are really dominant? Looking at change in the average annual payroll per employment, once again, D.C. ranked fairly well. 3 sectors, transportation and warehousing, arts, entertainment, recreation, and real estate and rental leasing. Those 3 sectors saw the largest increase in the average annual payroll per employment between 2012 and 2017. But I thought it was even more interesting to see the dominance of the state of Washington in these sectors. 5 sectors saw the largest increase in average annual payroll per employment in their sectors. One of them should come as no surprise to any of you who know anything about the businesses that are in Washington State, the information sector. the average employee, the employees of that information sector in Washington State earn on average about $40,000 more in 2017 than what they earned in 2012. That sector in that state saw the largest increase in Washington State. So again, kind of looking at what sectors are really growing the most in each state, and how are the workers in those sectors doing. Now, the last category I want to talk about when we talk about state rankings at the national level is revenue, sales, shipments, receipts, or revenue, the other measures of output that we have. Once again, California ranks number one in a lot of the sectors, and once again, Texas ranked number one in a couple sectors as well. It was interesting, though, to note that the manufacturing and wholesale trade sectors that were actually big in some other states happened to be ranked number one in the state of Texas. That makes me then wonder, are there certain industries in the state of Texas within the manufacturing sector that happen to be high dollar sales or shipments industries that accounted for the fact that the manufacturing sector in Texas is ranked number one? Some of you know that the manufacturing sector has done very well. A number of fairly large corporations have moved operations to Texas, or where their manufacturing operations in Texas have grown quite a bit. So again, kind of a very interesting comparison here. When we look at the change in revenue between 2012 and 2017, California, once again, pops up to the top, but then some other states show up in here. Texas ranked number one in the change in sales, shipments, receipts, or revenue for the transportation and warehousing sector. Manufacturing, though, in South Carolina had a big increase, showed the largest increase. That made me then wonder what manufacturing industries within South Carolina are accounting for the largest share of that manufacturing sector increase. I think I know what the answer is, but I want to dig some more to see what that actually is. And again, it speaks to the commitment to a particular state to growing a particular sector of their economy. If that sector is doing well, then the state does well. When that sector has a bad day, then maybe the state gets affected more because, again, they've put a lot of their eggs into that one sector basket. North Dakota was ranked number one in terms of the increase in revenue in the mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction sector. Those of you who know anything about the mining sector in North Dakota knows that this sector tends to be affected a lot by price change. And after 2017, we saw some real declines in the average price per barrel of crude oil. So it would be very interesting to see how is this sector still doing in North Dakota. And then finally, Illinois actually ranked number one in terms of the change in revenue for the management of companies and enterprises sector. This is the sector that includes company headquarters. Now, let's change gears a little tiny bit and talk just for a few minutes about the top sectors in each state. What are those sectors that are most important to each state? So this chart here talks about what sectors are top ranked in terms of the number of businesses. And it should come as probably no surprise to any of you that the retail trade sector is the top sector in terms of number of establishments in 36 of the 51 states. Texas is ranked number one in this sector with over 80,000, almost 81,000 retail establishments in the state of Texas. New York is right behind it in second place. And then you see this tapering off of the retail sector in the other states. Even in a state like Vermont, where the number of establishments is much smaller, it is still the number one sector in terms of number of establishments. The red highlighted bars are the construction sector. I want to make a mental note to remember this because I was quite fascinated to see that the number one sector in terms of numbers of businesses, number of establishments, locations, was the construction sector in Washington state, not other sectors. It wasn't retail, and it wasn't professional, scientific, and technical services, which is the green bars. The number one sector in terms of number of establishments in California is the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. We think about all the tech companies, quote unquote, that are located in California. There's 127,000. That is the number. That is the number one. I did just see a note pop up about if we were to incorporate the agriculture data into these charts, how would the rankings change? In some states, they wouldn't change at all. Agriculture in many states is relatively small and would not rank as the number one sector in a state. But in some states, the top rankings might change. We don't actually publish the data on agriculture at the Census Bureau because the National Center the National Agricultural Statistics Service does. But that would be a really interesting project. It would be to merge together to look at the agriculture sector and the rest of the economy to look at the overall economy of a state. The two black bars I thought was quite interesting, and those are for the healthcare sector. In Arizona, the healthcare sector is the number one sector in terms of numbers of business locations, number of establishments, with 18,816. That came as a surprise to me, and same thing for Alaska. Alaska was also ranked number one in terms of businesses in the healthcare sector. I would not have immediately thought about that. That, again, makes me think, I wonder what types of businesses, what types of healthcare businesses are dominant in terms of numbers of establishments in Arizona. Now, looking at the change in establishments, I mentioned on the previous slide, remember these red highlighted states, the fact that there are 4 states where construction was the number one sector in terms of numbers of establishments. On this next slide, we look at the change in the number of establishments between 2012 and 2017. And these red highlighted bars are, once again, the construction sector. I was really intrigued to see that construction was the number one growth sector in 34 of the 51 states in the United States. I found that just absolutely astounding, that sector had grown so much during this period, and especially in California and Florida and Texas, which are the top 3 ranked states. Professional, scientific, and technical services are the green bars, and you can see that Maryland saw the largest increase, my home state, saw the largest increase in the number of professional, scientific, and technical services sector businesses. If you've ever driven up the Route 270 corridor, driving away from the District of Columbia up toward northern Maryland, you'll see a whole host of tech services, biotech firms, et cetera, that are along that 270 corridor. You can really see that increase when you look at this data. The black highlighted bars, the 6 bars, are for the healthcare sector. And I was intrigued to see that Minnesota actually was ranked number one in terms of increase in the number of healthcare businesses in that state, followed by Arizona, very closely followed by Arizona. And finally, those last 5 bars, the orange-colored bars, are for the accommodation and food services sector. Tennessee saw the largest increase in the number of accommodation and food services establishments between 2012 and 2017. Oklahoma, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi were ranked next. Now, one of you just asked a question that sort of alluded to that comment I made earlier about how the mixture of businesses in a state and the growth in those businesses in a state can have an impact on how, quote-unquote, recession-proof a particular state might be. A state that has put a lot of their eggs into a particular sector of the economy, when that one sector of the economy is then greatly impacted by a major shock, like a pandemic, like COVID-19, then that state potentially could be more impacted because they put a lot of their state's economy is based on that particular sector. Certainly, we think about the accommodation and food services sectors. This is a sector that has been most impacted. NAICS 72 has seen the largest impact during the COVID-19 pandemic of any sector in the U.S. economy. They have seen the largest decline in the number of businesses. They have seen the largest decline in the employment, and they have seen the largest decline in their sales of any sector in the U.S. economy. So a state that might put a lot of their growth into this particular sector might, in some respects, really be sticking their neck out and could be impacted. So, yeah, that's a really interesting economic thing to think about. Now, we've been talking about each of these different sectors, and what I thought would be very interesting to provide here would be a relative comparison that looks at how the number of establishments by sector varies, or in some respects doesn't vary much across the nation. So just for giggles here, I pulled out the share of businesses by sector at the national level, United States, that's the first bar, the light blue bar, and then I worked my way around the country, starting in the Northeast with New York, moving to the South with Florida, then jumping across the country to California, and then moving back up the West Coast to Washington State. And when you look at the mixture of businesses, of establishments in each of these sectors, in each of these states, you see that really from state to state, they are often not very different. The relative mix of businesses don't vary that much, but I will say you do see some really interesting outliers. So, for example, we were talking a few moments ago about how the construction sector in Washington State saw a big increase. Look at the share of establishments in the construction sector in Washington State in comparison to New York, Florida, and California. It is substantially higher than the 9.4% that is the average for that construction sector across the entire United States. And this made me then say, well, I wonder how that distribution of businesses by sector varies in a couple of key selected sectors. So the first one that I picked on was the healthcare sector. We saw earlier how healthcare was a key top employer sector in the United States. I figured let's take a look at how the healthcare sector varies from state to state in terms of the share of all establishments that are in this particular sector. Nationally, about 11.75% of all establishments at the national level are in the healthcare sector, and you can see that that number ranges between about 13% down to a little less than 10%. But you do have a couple of outliers here. West Virginia, 14.21% of their businesses in the state are in the healthcare sector. We don't often think of West Virginia as being a sector or being a state that has a strong healthcare sector, but in this case you can see a very large percentage of their businesses in the state, a larger percentage than the national average, are in the healthcare sector. And at the opposite extreme, we have North Dakota, where only 8.76% of the businesses are in the healthcare sector. When we think about economic opportunity and the places where certain types of businesses are needed, I would argue that any of the states to the right of the national average are ones that are ripe for opening a healthcare business because they have less than the national average in terms of the total share. On the construction sector, we saw a similar kind of thing, even more exaggerated. Nationally, about 9.4% of all establishments are in the construction sector, but you look at states like Idaho and Montana that account for over 15% of the businesses in the state are in that one particular sector. I found that really quite fascinating. I wanted to then dig into the data for Idaho and Montana to see what types of construction businesses are these in. Are these residential construction businesses, or these commercial, industrial, institutional, or are these heavy construction? It would be really interesting to see where is that construction industry doing so well and has become such a large share of the economy in those two states. At the opposite extreme, you have the District of Columbia. For any of you who have ever been into D.C., you probably know that there are very few construction businesses based in the District of Columbia because most of the construction that is done in D.C. is done by businesses that are located outside of the District of Columbia. Only 2% of all businesses in the District of Columbia are construction sector businesses. Changing gears to the professional, scientific, and technical services sector, again, another one that seemed really interesting when we were looking at that. We again see some really interesting comparisons. The national average is about 12.04%, but we see outliers like the District of Columbia, where almost 26% of all businesses in the District of Columbia are in this particular sector. Now, you all can probably think of all the consultants and the engineering firms and the architecture firms and other types of technical businesses that are physically located here in the D.C. area. I expected a lot of them would be in Northern Virginia, but apparently a lot of them are in the District of Columbia. Again, this speaks to the commitment of to D.C. to this particular sector of the economy as being a key part of their economy. If something were to happen to this particular sector, these businesses, the District of Columbia, might be impacted more by those businesses not doing quite as well. At the opposite extreme, we have North Dakota and South Dakota, where a fairly small percent, about 7.6% of the businesses are in this particular sector. And then finally, we have on slide 26, or excuse me, not finally, we have the retail trade sector. You see that we all know that this sector has been impacted quite a bit by the economy, by the coronavirus pandemic. Nationally, about 14% of all businesses are in the retail trade sector. At the far right extreme, we once again have District of Columbia. Many of you know that most D.C. residents don't go shopping for retail in the District of Columbia. They drive into suburban Maryland or into Northern Virginia to do their shopping. Only 7.76% of all retail businesses in the District of Columbia are retail businesses. Where on the opposite extreme, Mississippi and Alabama are heavily retail-based businesses. About almost 21% of all businesses in the state of Mississippi are in the retail sector. Now, the last slide that I have here, second to last slide we have here, talks a little bit about employment. We talked about establishments, now let's look at employment. And once again, we see that dominant employment across the vast majority of the states, 41 of 51 states, is in the healthcare sector. California, over 2 million workers work in the healthcare sector in California. They account for the largest number of workers of any sector in the state. New York is ranked number 2 and Texas number 3. Again, big states, you would expect large numbers of healthcare workers. It was somewhat interesting to me, though, to see that the manufacturing sector is the top employer in both Wisconsin and Indiana. Just in March, my wife and I purchased a travel trailer. It has been a lifesaver for us during the COVID-19 pandemic, giving us the ability to escape our home while still staying socially distanced and being safe. Our trailer was built in Indiana. So thank you, Indianans, for the very strong RV industry. The green highlighted bars are the retail sector. In Utah and New Hampshire, those two states, retail trade is the number 1 employer. The yellow highlighted, again, I apologize for that very pale color. I was running out of colors to choose. Virginia and the District of Columbia, both are very dominant states in terms of employment in the professional, scientific, and technical services sector. 470,000 workers in the state of Virginia work in that particular sector. It would be very interesting to look at the distribution of those workers geographically. Are they primarily clustered in the Northern Virginia area, as I would probably suspect, or there are also a lot of folks that work in this sector across the state? And then finally, the last 2 sectors, the administrative and support and waste management and remediation services sector. We've already talked about this. Florida, over 1.7 million workers work in this sector in the state of Florida. And then in the far right, columns, we see two very tourism-focused states, Nevada and Hawaii, where the accommodation and food services sector is the #1 employer. When I think about states that have been most impacted by the business closures that have happened during COVID-19, I think a lot about Nevada, a state where you have a very large share of their workforce that works in some of the businesses that have been most impacted by closures. Same thing for Hawaii. Of course, that's paradise, so they have something to be said for that. And then finally, the last slide here today is talking about the distribution of sales. Wholesale trade sector is typically the sector that has the highest output, the highest sales of any sector in the U.S. economy. You can see Texas and California are ranked #1 and 2 in wholesale trade. In this case, 32 of the 51 states, this is the largest sector. But once again, we see this very interesting thing where manufacturing, as we pointed out in the American Account story, is the top sector in terms of shipments in a number of states. Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, Wisconsin, South Carolina, Alabama, Kentucky, Iowa, Mississippi, Utah, and West Virginia. Manufacturing is the top sector in terms of shipments in that state, in terms of output of businesses in that state. So that was a very quick run through some key selected statistics for some key pointers. I do want to tell everybody that there are more data coming out from the Economic Census. We already teased you a little tiny bit that tomorrow we're going to be releasing those product lines data. Again, I would encourage you all to go in and explore these data more. I know I sort of have my work cut out for me during my holiday next week to go in and actually do that. I did just see a note posted about, are we going to post the PowerPoint file? Yes, the recording and the transcript and the PowerPoint presentation, and if you would like, the Excel file that contains all of the data that I downloaded will be posted up to our webinars page for you to go in and actually further manipulate this data. I would really encourage you all to get in there and smartly drill down to look at those more detailed levels. Now, the last point I want to make today is that while the data we talked about today was from the 2017 Economic Census, we do publish data annually, quarterly, and monthly that can be used to supplement these data. And I would definitely recommend that you look at these other data products to see what's happened in the national and state economies since 2017. I think you will see that some sectors have had very little change in terms of their overall rankings, and other ones have changed quite a bit, certainly in the last 9 months. Again, getting on my soapbox, I would encourage you all to please use the resources that we have at Census to understand comparability of geography and industry changes over time, so that when you are making comparisons of data from no matter who the data are from, that you are making sure the data are comparable. Data.census.gov, I want to encourage you all to learn how to use it, and certainly to send us your feedback on it. I know a number of you who I saw who are attending today have provided feedback on data.census.gov. I kind of annoy them all the time, but it's very important that you do provide that, because you are helping to shape what this application does, and we want you all to promote its use with your colleagues as well. And finally, from an admittedly selfish perspective, Census Business Builder, my personal baby, is providing access to some of the 2017 Economic Census data, as well as a lot of other data. And yes, we are adding more data from the Economic Census to Census Business Builder in the next few releases. So with that, I am ready to actually start taking some questions. I know, Greg, we've been having, I'm on with my colleague, Greg Hewitt. I've been trying to keep up with the chat questions as they've been coming in. But Greg, if you want to quickly look through the chat and see if I missed any particular questions or comments that people had, that would be fantastic.
Sure thing, Andy. Let me just scan through here. And if I mention one that you have already mentioned, we can go past that, because I know you've been
Sure.
checking those out as you could. Let's see. And to the audience, if I miss yours, my apologies. Feel free to send your question in to the contact information on the screen there. But here's one. Could the PEOs in Florida be related to the cruise industry?
So the short answer is probably not, because a lot of the employees of the cruise industry are actually paid employees of those businesses. They are typically not leased employees. PEOs tend to focus on manufacturing workers and workers in other sectors. Cruise lines would not probably be one of those sectors, one of those industries where PEOs would be important. Cruise lines are actually in a completely different industry. I did just see someone posted a chat note about my reference to the agriculture data. The U.S. Department for Agriculture, National Agricultural Statistics Service, USDA NAICS, is the main source of data on the agriculture sector. If you Google USDA NAICS, you'll come to their site. They've got a pretty nice data tool that lets you go in and look at the agriculture data, and you can actually download that information as well. I did also see someone pop up a question about military. So in that list of 18 sectors that you saw that we published data for, two of the sectors that we don't publish data for are agriculture, we already talked about that one, and government, NAICS 92. So the vast majority of military workers, of people in the military, would not be classified in one of these other industries. They would be classified in NAICS 92 in that particular government sector, and they would not be included in here. However, there are some military workers that work as employees of companies that manufacture, for example, military components. And those workers would be counted in that manufacturing industry where they are working. But typically, I say the military workers, and for that matter, all government employees, are excluded from the Economic Census data. That actually makes the rankings in the District of Columbia look quite interesting. If we included government employees in those overall rankings, the number one sector in DC might not be the sector that, it might not be professional, scientific, and technical services if we counted government workers. Any other questions in the chat, Greg?
Not that, I'm not sure if I've missed any, and I don't know if you want to open up the phones to a couple of questions. Totally up to you.
Yeah, that would be great. Operator, if you want to open up the phone lines for anybody who has any questions over the phone, that would be super.
Thank you. If you'd like to ask a question over the phone, please press star followed by the number 1. Please make sure to unmute your phone and record your name at the prompt. Again, that is star 1 for any questions from the phone. One moment, please, while any questions come through. I am showing no questions at this time.
Okay. So I do see someone did post a note here about a report that the Brookings Institution released that looked at the top 100 metropolitan areas and looked at data on industry and occupation from the population census for 2010, looking at skilled workers. As many of you know, we publish data on workforce from a number of different directions at the Census Bureau. Our demographic programs do include some information about industry and occupation, but those data are not nearly as detailed from an industry perspective as what you would see on the business side at the Census Bureau. And maybe more importantly, those demographic counted workers are counted based upon where they live, not where they work. The business data that we publish at Census is tabulated based upon where that business is physically located. So, for example, just thinking about here in the D.C. area, there are an awful lot of us that live in one state, like Maryland, and work in Virginia or work in D.C. So counting those workers based upon where they live versus where they work does have quite a big impact in some geographies on how the data are shown up. So yes, that's a very kind of interesting way of looking at it. There are definitely some occupation data that is, if you're looking at truly interested in occupation data, there really are, the demographic data really is a better way of coming at that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a really great occupation data series. But yes, there's definitely many different ways of looking at the workforce. We do have one program at Census that actually mashes up where workers live and where workers work, and it is presented in a tool called On the Map. So for those of you who might be interested in looking at sort of commuting patterns of workforces, of the workforce, that would be a great tool to do. So Jennifer also asked the question, what is the best way to incorporate the Small Business Pulse Survey when we're talking about the Economic Census and these other data? So the Small Business Pulse Survey, as its name implies, looks at just a portion of the businesses that are covered by the Economic Census. It is a sample survey that is of small businesses. The sample size is fairly small, and the definition of what constitutes a small business does vary from industry to industry. They've got some great documentation. So the best way to incorporate that data is once we have released our small business data, the establishment and firm size data from the Economic Census, where you see how some industries are very dominated by small businesses and other industries not so much. What I want to personally do is then match up the 2017 Economic Census small business data with the Small Business Pulse Survey data to see how have those small businesses fared in the last 9 months during this pandemic. Those businesses that were not dominant in 2017 Economic Census, yes, they might be impacted as seen by the Small Business Pulse Survey, but in the overall scheme of things, those small businesses were relatively fairly small in terms of the economy of their local area. In other sectors of the U.S. economy, small businesses are not only numerous in number, but they are significant in impact. If we didn't count small daycare centers in the Economic Census, they account for like 70% of the workforce that work in daycare centers, and that's not even counting the non-employers, the home-based daycare centers. Those establishment and firm size data will be coming out on December 1st, or excuse me, December 2nd, and they are going to be an interesting look at the distribution of businesses by business size. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I'm going to actually be doing a webinar specifically on the importance of and the definition of just what is a small business on December 8th. So if you want to check out our webinars page where you went to learn about today's webinar and where the webinar is going to be posted, that's where you'll see information about that NAICS webinar that I'm doing on December 1st. And the small business size data webinar that I'm doing on December 8th. So yeah, great question. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Again, I appreciate all the great questions. If you didn't get your question answered today in the chat or over the phone, you see my email address here on the screen. You can tell I'm not shy. So please feel free to contact me. I've also included my phone number, and I am on LinkedIn. So if you are interested in connecting via LinkedIn, please feel free to reach out to me that way as well. So thank you very much again for taking time out of your busy schedules, and have a great afternoon.